Hey everyone, it is Wednesday, February 18th, and as I'm sure you guys are well aware, we have another snow day here. So that means today is another e-learning day. This presentation and the activities going with it are all up on Canvas in our Topic 8 module. If you guys have any questions about how to do anything or what to do, just get a hold of me, send me an email. Um, this will double both for the e-learning and assuming we're in school on Thursday, the 18th, we will also do this in class as well to kind of keep everyone on pace. So, last class we kind of touched on a little bit about the start of the Cold War, and now we're going to kind of get into some aspects of the Cold War that things like the Truman Doctrine, containment, and a little bit of the Marshall Plan that they kind of lead into here in the Cold War proper. So, let's go ahead and start with the Berlin airlift, guys, and it's a pretty simple thing here, all things considered. Um, as you can read on the screen there, you can see Stalin, who has basically he effectively has control over Berlin, the capital city of Germany, because it's in the Soviet sector. If you remember when we talked about the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conferences and all those conferences, one of the things that was discussed was dividing Germany into four sections, but not only that, Berlin as well. So Stalin is a little bit unhappy with how things are going. He's looking to try and push it. It's kind of a power play by him, really, trying to push communism a little more, trying to push more control for him. And in order to get the other former allies of World War II to kind of try and give in to what he's after, he decides to cut off all supplies and traffic to Berlin. Um, so effectively, um, Berlin is cut off, it's isolated, especially Western Berlin. So the problem with this, guys, is there's only so many supplies that the Germans living there have. You know, think about things you need to heat your home, food, the basic essentials of life. It's not going to be very long before they're going to start running out. So Stalin's hope here really is that by cutting this off, he'll get the other allies to give in to his demands and ideas in order to restart that flow of trade and traffic and stuff like that. The Allies, on the other hand, they kind of organize, especially the U.S. and Britain, they organize a massive airlift, officially called Operation Vittles, although it's more commonly called the Berlin Airlift. And they basically just kind of round the clock um, for a few months. They just kind of, and really it's almost a year, but they just round the clock take massive aircraft planes, like think gigantic bombers, those sort of things, cargo planes, and they just load them up with supplies, and they just take them and they basically airdrop them in to Berlin. So the city of Berlin is effectively supplied by the French, but and the British and the Americans, mostly the British and the Americans, by airplane for nearly a year. And well, this is very expensive, of course. It does work, and Stalin eventually has to back off because, like, okay, my plan is not working. They're still able to get supplies, so now I'm just doing this, and I'm looking a little silly. So he eventually calls it off, and trade resumes and supplying resumes. You can kind of see pictures there in the bottom right, the supplies being dropped in kind of the middle left picture at the bottom, and then on the bottom right, far bottom right corner, you can kind of see people being excited about what's going on, like, yay, we're getting supplies. They're very grateful. So just kind of thinking about this, guys, that's the Berlin airlift. How is this a bit of an example of the Cold War? I mean, this is again, we're starting to see some of that conflict over communism and more democratic ideas, capitalism versus communism. Stalin is trying to push communism, and guess who's there to meet it? In particular, the United States. This is kind of going back to that Truman Doctrine. Remember how Greece and Turkey got all that money because they were trying to resist communism? Well, here we are, kind of the Truman idea concept a little bit, and containment as well, just trying to keep communism where it is at so it doesn't spread. We're trying to get involved here at this point. So this is an example, definitely, of the Cold War going on here. Moving on a little bit here, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, guys, you can see all of the countries that are listed there, and basically what these are is they're defense agreements. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they countries involved basically say, you know what, Norway, you know, if Bulgaria attacks you or the Soviet Union attacks you, all of these other countries are going to come to their aid. Um, so does this kind of remind you guys of anything a little bit where, hey, I got your back and I've got your back, and if someone attacks you, I'll get involved. The Warsaw Pact kind of does the same thing, guys, and it's primarily the Eastern Bloc countries plus the Soviet Union. Thinking about this, guys, does this maybe remind you of anything about, oh, 30 to 40 years before this, maybe. Thinking World War One era, where there's an alliance system. Is this kind of similar? You guys can kind of think on that a little bit. But so we've got some agreements here by these various countries on two different sides of the Cold War to kind of back each other up and help each other out if there's conflict. Here's something to consider. What if there had been a conflict? Would we have seen another world war except for this one instead of divided, kind of Nazis and Italians and the Japanese, versus the other countries would have been more along the lines of communism versus democracy and capitalism? Would we have seen a different sort of world war? Something to consider here. A few things of notes, guys, as you guys have seen in some of the maps we've shown, Switzerland's kind of not aligned because they almost always aren't. They're always trying to stay neutral. They do have their own military, but they try and stay neutral to kind of try and promote stability and peace. Like if you look throughout the world wars of the world's history, you will almost always find Switzerland being neutral. Almost always. Spain is they're fascist, remember, and so they're anti-communist, and they're still weakened due to that civil war they had in the 1930s, which is also why they settled World War II. So they're still recovering, and they don't really want to get involved. Austria, like Germany, was split after the German Anschluss, and they get their independence back. They're basically kind of held by a neutrality treaty, so they can't get involved because they've agreed not to. Yugoslavia was communist, but they didn't really want to get into the Warsaw Pact, so they're kind of just left out in a sense. So they're not really officially aligned with anyone, although they are probably closer aligned with the Soviet Union because they are communist. And if you look at the countries there in green, the countries there in orange, they kind of align, you'll see, with the Warsaw Pact and the NATO agreement, excuse me. So moving on to China here, guys. You can see the Chinese Civil War. This Chinese Civil War has really been raging for 25 years or so, minus the gap in the middle. Think about that for a second. 1937 to 1946. Is there any reason you guys can think of that there would not be a Chinese Civil War happening? Maybe some bigger conflict. Maybe someone knocking at their front door trying to take control. Maybe thinking like the World War II issue that we talked about, just a tiny little thing, right? Well, excluding the break between for World War II, you have the nationalists and the communists fighting. On your right is a guy named Mao Zedong, and on the left is a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. Thinking about this, guys, based on the pictures, just look at them for a split second here. Which guy do you think is going to be supported by the U.S.? Chiang Kai-shek on the left of your screen or Mao Zedong on the right of your screen? There is something that should definitely clue you in as to who the U.S. will support. Hopefully, you guys noted that it was Chiang Kai-shek, because if you look at Mao Zedong on the right-hand side there, you'll notice behind him is the hammer and sickle, the Soviet symbol, thus meaning he is aligned with the Soviet Union, he is a communist, and we are certainly not going to be fighting on the side of the communists at this point. So we're going to support Chiang Kai-shek, but the problem for the U.S., guys, is that China is going to go communist. Mao Zedong is going to win because they're just fighting the war better. And on top of that, the people, the peasants, Mao says, look, I'm going to get you food, I'm going to get you land, things that the peasants want. And so they ultimately support the communists. And in 1949, China goes communist. This is an air quotes loss because, well, we didn't directly lose this. Think about what the Cold War is all about, right? It's all about spreading democracy and capitalism or spreading communism, depending which side of the Cold War you're on. And we just, air quotes, lost China. Think about why that would be important, guys. How many people live in China? How large of a country is in China? Is this a major influential country, all things considered? Remember, they have a permanent seat on the UN. They're a pretty influential, powerful country, all things considered, and they just went communist. This is not a good look for the US here. So the People's Republic of China is now established, and it's a communist country. The nationalists don't just like get wiped out or anything, but they flee to Taiwan and create the Republic of China, which we support. And kind of an interesting thing, guys, is even today in like 2021, these governments are still there in Taiwan and China. And at the time, anyways, we don't officially recognize the communist government. We don't officially say that they're a country. That's a pretty big step here, guys, in us refuting communism here. So again, kind of thinking about this in the context of the Chinese Civil War here, how is this an example of um, the Cold War. Is this do we see the Truman Doctrine in play? Do we see containment in play? Well, not exactly, because we don't directly really get involved in the Chinese Civil War here because it's the Chinese Civil War. But what comes after is going to be a big deal. We're kind of smarting, we're stinging from this loss here a little bit. So we kind of think ahead, okay, well, we got to get back on track here with, if anything else happens, anybody else is trying to go communist, Truman Doctrine, we got to get in there, we got to help them out, whether it's money or whatever, and we got to contain communism. It can exist where it is, but it can't keep spreading, which means Korea, guys. If you look in the map there, you can see where Taiwan's located, and you can see where communist China and stuff like that. But looking at Korea here, and you can kind of see the mouse circling on the map a little bit. That's where we're headed next, because this is going to be the first real major conflict of the Cold War, if you will. Because we kind of see it as like, well, we already air quotes lost China. We can't lose Korea as well. North Korea, as you can see the border there, guys, it shares a border with mostly China and a tiny little bit of Russia there. They're going to be backed by the Chinese and by extension the Soviets as well. So the North is going to be a communist government located in Pyongyang there. You can see on the map. In the South, in Seoul, South Korea, we help establish a democratic and capitalist government. And you can see that they are divided approximately along the 38th parallel there. It's not exact, but if you were to put the 38th parallel, guys, running horizontally across your screen, it would intersect more or less right there at the division points of North Korea and South Korea. So at this point, guys, think about Truman Doctrine. North Korea is wanting to kind of expand and turn all of Korea communist as well. So you got the Truman Doctrine that's going to come into play here. If people are resisting communism, we've got to get involved, right? Whether it's money or soldiers or whatever, we've got to fight communism wherever it's trying to expand. And this is also the containment policy. Now, thinking about this for a split second, guys, is this technically our fight? Is this really anything to do with us other than, ideological beliefs? Not really. But things like containment and the Truman Doctrine in the context of the Cold War are going to draw us into this conflict here that takes place only a few short years after World War II, because we simply can't lose all of Korea as well. So the Korean War, guys, lasts for about 3 years, and if you look at the graphic on the right, it kind of shows you the timeline of how the war goes a little bit. The red being the communists and the green being the democratic capitalists. North Korea, June 25th, 1950, they advance across the 38th parallel. And this is not cool because this is potentially the entire country going communist. So, President Truman, we don't go it alone this time, like we do in other situations, but we get the UN involved, and we send United Nations forces in, led by General MacArthur. World War II here, and the North Koreans get pushed back, and they get pushed all the way almost back to China. Thinking about this for a second, though, guys, in 1950, Chinese troops entered, and all of a sudden now we're basically at a stalemate back along that original border. Should we push into China? Should we do an all-out bombing campaign? Should we use nuclear weapons here against China, North Korea, etc.? Think about that for a second, guys, and think in the back of your mind, what kind of repercussions could there be if we were to invade China or if we were to use nuclear weapons? Because kind of think about being a communist government in North Korea, they're linked to the Chinese. Who are the Chinese also linked to as well? Hopefully, you guys are kind of thinking that, well, all the communists are kind of aligned, which would mean the North Koreans are aligned with the Chinese, and they're by extension also aligned with the Soviets. So if we were to use nuclear weapons against, say, North Korea or China, who's probably going to use nuclear weapons back? Probably the Soviet Union. So this is a big mess here, guys, and potentially a nuclear war issue here as well. Ultimately, though, guys, with the conflict stopping there around the 38th parallel again, a ceasefire is signed. Fun fact: officially, the Korean War is still happening since there was no official treaty signed. We are still technically at war, technically. So that's the Korean War, guys, and some things to think about. So, now part of your activity, guys, there are some other questions as well, but it's up on Canvas, and there's this article as well here with these 5 questions as well. So go ahead and watch this presentation, read over the Korean War documents, guys, and then go ahead and complete that activity and submit it all by the due date on Canvas. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me. Good luck, guys.